Joining us now, Punchbowl News co-founder and MSNBC political contributor Jake Sherman. I know she said she's going to put the Constitution above everything else. So why is it so hard for her? Please explain it to me. Why is it so hard for her and other nominees to comment on a hypothetical like that? If the president breaks the law, asked you to break the law, would you do it?
Katie, the way these hearings are designed is you don't need to answer any questions. You could get away with saying, I'm not going to talk about hypotheticals. My duty is to the Constitution. My duty is to the rule of law. And when you have a Senate Republican conference that is way, way more loyal to Donald Trump than it was in 2017, and even 2017 to 2021, you are going to have senators who are going to vote yes regardless. And quite frankly, Senate Republicans probably have one nominee that's standing that they could kill. They can't kill them all, and I don't think they want to get rid of Pam Bondi. But these hearings are just designed to be able to evade, and there's nothing that senators can do to force her into any nominee, not only Pam Bondi, but any nominee into a corner and force them to answer questions they don't want to answer, again, especially with the entirety of the Senate Republican conference marching lockstep behind her and Donald Trump.
Is it ultimately because the public isn't paying close attention, the public isn't demanding answers to questions like this?
Yeah, and I think a few things. I don't think that not anybody, I think the vast majority of people don't know and don't care who the Attorney General is. I don't know that, to be honest with you, I don't know that plays a difference in the confirmation process. I don't think it makes a difference. I don't think it plays a role. That's number one. And number two, I think that the nominees that go up to Capitol Hill, Donald Trump's nominees, know how to play to Trump. They know that what they have to say, what they should say, and what they shouldn't say to get confirmed. I mean, the real test here, Katie, will be somebody like Tulsi Gabbard, who's nominated to be the Director of National Intelligence, who has a long history and many questions about her contacts with other countries, her previous distaste for FISA and for wiretapping capabilities that today CIA Director John Ratcliffe said make up the majority of the intelligence that is presented to the President of the United States. So all of that put together, I think that the playbook here is relatively clear.
What about Kash Patel? He came up quite a bit during this confirmation hearing. She was asked frequently about what she would demand of him, what she would allow him to do as head of the FBI if she were confirmed. Why so much concern about Kash Patel?
Well, number one, the basic premise that the FBI does fall under the Department of Justice. It's part of the Department of Justice. And I mean, then there's Kash Patel, the person, right? He has spoken a lot over the last 10 or so years about what he thinks of the government and what he would do if afforded power and if confirmed to be the FBI director. I would say, Katie, I am relatively surprised by how well received Kash Patel has been by members of the Senate Republican Conference. Maybe not surprised, but gobsmacked, perhaps, is the right way to say it, because it seems like, to be honest with you, the odds are that he will get confirmed as well. Can't swear to that. There's obviously two tiers of nominees here. There's the Marco Rubios, the Pam Bondis. I wouldn't put them in the same category, but the John Ratcliffe. That is the general column of people who are going to get confirmed. Doug Burgum, people like that. Then there's Kash Patel and Tulsi Gabbard, and Pete Hegseth, who's going to get confirmed, was perhaps in the latter category. Now he's no longer. He's most likely, almost certainly going to get confirmed. I think there is a volume of evidence that Kash Patel, what he would do if he was in charge of the FBI, and I think that will come up should he make it to a confirmation hearing.
One of the reasons why Kash Patel's name came up was that he has an enemies list. People that he thinks should be prosecuted. They talk about investigating the investigators. Jack Smith was one of those names that came up. Liz Cheney came up as well. But there was a particularly contentious moment between Adam Schiff, the new senator from California, obviously formerly a congressman who we all know well, asking her whether there would be an investigation into the special counsel, into Jack Smith. Let's listen.
The president has said Jack Smith should go to jail. Will you investigate Jack Smith?
Senator, I haven't seen the file. I haven't seen the investigation. I haven't looked at anything. It would be irresponsible of me to make a commitment regarding anything.
So a summary by the president or his desire to investigate Jack Smith would not be enough for you to open an investigation of Jack Smith. Is that right?
I will look at the facts and evidence in any case.
What is the desire on Capitol Hill to see these sorts of investigations, perhaps to see an investigation into a former colleague like Liz Cheney?
The appetite is quite high, to be honest with you. There's a lot of people in the House Republican Conference. By the way, they're standing right behind me right now in a room talking about tax reform. The appetite is quite high to see investigations into people like Jack Smith, Liz Cheney, people who have been involved in some of the January 6th prosecutions and investigations. The jury is out. We reported, Katie, just yesterday or the day before that there's active conversations between members of the January 6th committee and the Biden White House about potential pardons, and that is still very much on the table when it comes to members of the January 6th committee, Liz Cheney, Benny Thompson, people of that nature who have been very active and very outspoken about what Donald Trump did or did not do on January 6th.
And bring us up to speed on Rubio quickly and John Ratcliffe. They also faced hearings today. How did their confirmation processes go?
Very well. You could tell they're former members of Congress because they are very well equipped to answer questions and to proceed quite smoothly. I think these are going to be two of the earliest nominees that are confirmed, perhaps along with Pete Hegseth, to be honest with you. I would imagine that Hegseth is much closer to a party line vote. But I really think, Katie, that Marco Rubio and John Ratcliffe are going to get confirmed probably with wide bipartisan margins. I just think they are two of the, if you put them in the mix of all the people that Trump has nominated, two of the shining stars, according to Republicans and Democrats, people who are practiced, people who are well equipped for the job. You might not agree with them if you're a Democrat on everything, but you would have a tough time making a case that they're not qualified for the job.